In the past 2 episodes, we explored why Africa has sought to take greater ownership of peace support on the continent, and why doing so is increasingly difficult. We saw both the promise and the peril of Africa-led peace operations. So what happens next? Instead of asking how Africa-led peace support will work, a more revealing question may be, who is the new peacekeeper, and what kind of peace support is emerging?
We're moving into a completely new paradigm. Between 2014 and 2020, the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, part of the Pentagon's Institute, their study revealed that between 2014 and 2020, there was a 400% rise in insurgencies, okay, across Africa. If you look at that, then you look today, you look at all of the groups, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, Azawad, etc. Put into that mix the organized criminal syndicates. They are not obligated to follow the rules of war. They are not bound by the Geneva Convention. So in that context, you can't talk about peacekeeping. If you put a peacekeeper there, they will shoot at you.
What this has led to is not one new model, but many. African-led peace support operations today take different forms depending on the conflict and the actors involved. Some are led by the African Union, others are organized by regional bodies or coalitions of states, often with AU support. In the Sahel, the G5 Sahel Joint Force was created as a cross-border response to armed groups operating across the region. In southern Africa, the SADC mission in Mozambique, followed by a bilateral operation by Rwanda, was deployed to support the government in confronting an insurgency in Cabo Delgado. Together, these missions reflect a broader shift. African peace support is no longer defined by a single model, but by a range of approaches shaped by different conflicts.
We need peace enforcement. But peace enforcement is not the same as peacekeeping. There's huge legal implications in peace enforcement. So the UN has to have new doctrine, new equipment, new training. All these things cost a lot of money. At a time when nobody wants to finance traditional peacekeeping, how they're going to finance peace enforcement.
The move toward more robust missions also raises difficult questions about what must guide peace support beyond military effectiveness.
Everything is based on a normative framework of sorts, right? And I think if we go back to these frameworks as base documents where human rights actors fit in, where the humanitarian sector fits in, in terms of ceasefire negotiations, the role of women in peace processes, the role of youth in peace processes. So there are a number of frameworks that can guide this.
Robust enforcement can halt violence, but it cannot build peace on its own. The longer-term challenge lies in addressing the political and social root causes of conflict. This is often called the civilian dimension of peace support and refers to the experts who support political dialogue, elections, rule of law, and rebuilding state institutions.
When we talk of funding, for example, with troop contributing, police contributing, these are coming out of member states. But the civilian function is almost the anomaly in it, because its deployment has to happen via the AU or via a REC. So it's not as if the deployment is happening on the basis that a member state will fund a position, for example, because it's almost now like a forgotten aspect in a mission.
Whether peace support succeeds often depends less on mandates than on how missions are perceived by local communities.
Reviewing and adapting Africa-led peace support operation should take also into consideration the legitimacy in the eyes of the local communities, making sure the host community and local populations are involved in the design and implementation of peace support operation. Since the troops and the police are sourced from African countries, some say that they have a better comparative advantage when it comes to engaging with the local populations. But at the same time, there are also questions around adherence to international humanitarian laws, enforcing these compliance frameworks that are being currently developed.
Can I ask you just to follow up?
Yes.
I just want to follow up so that I understand. When you say that there were doctrinal differences between African peace support operations and UN peacekeeping, can you say something more about that? Is it that the AU has the ability to intervene in ways that the UN Charter doesn't really permit peacekeeping, or?
One of the main limitations is arising from the cardinal principles that underlie UN peacekeeping: consent, impartiality, and the limited use of force unless for the protection of civilians. They are no more viable in a typical African conflicts that we are seeing. So in the practical sense, you're not in a position to get, for example, to solicit the consent of the warring parties. By this, we are talking about the consent of Al-Shabaab, the consent of the Al-Qaeda in Maghreb, and the others. This, let's say, normative limitation has actually led to finding, let's say, an innovative way of deploying this peace support operation without really seeking the consent of the warring parties.
Behind every design choice sits a constraint that is rarely discussed frankly or conclusively: resources.
We need to be very creative in the way we access funds for our missions, because without security, there cannot be prosperity. You can't rely on the European Union. The European Union have their own priorities, and Somalia is a lot far from the heart of Europe. It is an African problem, and we need to increase our financial footprint in our peace and security architecture.
The future of African-led peace support will not be defined by ambition alone. It will depend on how these missions are financed and on the choices made about how they are designed and deployed. Who contributes, who commands, and how military, police, and civilian roles are combined will shape not only how operations function, but how they are experienced on the ground. African-led peace support is evolving, shaped by experience, constraint, and necessity. It is not a finished project, but a contested and changing